I had been on the road for years, accustomed to the silence of lonely nights and the constant rumble of my truck's engine. That dawn, however, what normally brought me a sense of peace turned into an inexplicable nightmare. I was driving down the deserted highway, my headlights cutting through the darkness as the asphalt stretched endlessly before me. The radio, usually a faithful companion, was now whispering a soulless melody as if it too sensed what was coming. It all started subtly. I had pulled over at a small curve to have some coffee and stretch my legs, just as I always did during long journeys. The weather seemed normal. The night was cold but dry, and the solitude of the road was something I knew well. Yet, as I returned to the truck and resumed my trip, something felt off. Amid the silence, one detail stood out. In the passenger seat, where there had always been nothing but emptiness, there was now a man. I had no recollection of stopping to pick anyone up. My heart pounded uncontrollably, and a cold sweat began to drip down my forehead. I fought against the rising panic, trying to rationalize the inexplicable. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of exhaustion after so many long hours alone on the road. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, an unsettling feeling settled in. He was there, silent, his eyes fixed on me. The man looked ordinary, dressed in a simple jacket and dark pants, yet there was something in his gaze that hinted at deep, unsettling knowledge. His eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, as if they had witnessed unimaginable horrors. I tried to look away, focusing on the road, but I couldn't escape that piercing stare that followed me even through the rearview mirror. Without warning, he broke the silence. His voice was low, yet carried an almost tangible weight. "You know too much," he said, almost in a whisper, but with a clarity that cut through the cold air of the cabin. That phrase, so simple and direct, sent a chill through me. I tried to respond, but the words failed me, swallowed by the fear that paralyzed me. As I pressed the accelerator, desperate to outrun that disturbing presence, his words began to repeat, as if he were reciting a list of sins and secrets I had never shared with anyone. Each phrase was an accusation, each syllable a revelation of my deepest fears. He spoke of details no one could have possibly known, of moments of weakness and poor choices, things I had buried deep within my memory. I started questioning whether any of this was real or just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But with every mile, his presence became more tangible. I saw his reflection in the mirror, and he remained there, unshaken, with that enigmatic, unsettling smile. With each turn of the road, the sensation of being watched intensified, and the air inside the cabin felt heavier, as if it carried a palpable darkness. The conversation with the stranger grew even more disturbing. He never asked questions, only made statements, as if reading from a book written in the ink of my own life. "Do you remember that rainy night when everything changed? Do you recall the mistakes you made when no one was watching?" His words came at precise intervals, alternating between silence and an intensity that made time feel suspended. My survival instincts told me to turn off the radio, close my eyes, and pretend this was just a nightmare. But the truth was, I couldn't escape that voice. It felt like it was coming from inside me. As the highway stretched ahead, the landscape also began to change. What had once been a simple, empty road now looked distorted, with shadows that seemed to move on their own, and a darkness that took on almost tangible shapes. The once familiar environment became a stage for memories I had tried to forget, moments marked by mistakes and desperate choices. Each stretch of asphalt felt like a reminder of sins I thought I had left behind, and the passenger's voice seemed to pry into every dark corner of my past. I vividly remember stopping at a gas station to refuel. When I returned to the truck, a shiver ran down my spine as I noticed a dark stain on the steering wheel, as if cold fingers had just passed over it. When I tried to wipe it away, the stain seemed to spread, taking the shape of a symbol I couldn't decipher. My hands trembled, and I no longer felt strong enough to keep the truck under control. But what terrified me the most was the feeling that the passenger was still there, smiling at me, even though I could never quite see his face clearly. The conversation continued, and his words became increasingly personal and disturbing. He mentioned specific moments from my life as if he had experienced each of them by my side. "You cannot escape the past," he said. in a voice that wavered between compassion and disdain. There was no mercy in his words, only a coldness that made me shudder. The surroundings seemed to react to his presence. The radio began to emit static, the truck's lights flickered sporadically, and the wind outside acquired an almost whistling sound, as if nature itself were mourning what was happening. At one point, I tried to take control of the situation. With trembling hands, I forced my gaze toward the passenger seat, hoping to find an explanation for what I was experiencing. But the man seemed to float, as if he did not belong to this world. His gaze, when it met mine, was so profound that I could feel the anguish and anger accumulated from years of guilt. He did not smile. He simply observed, as if waiting for me to acknowledge the hidden truth behind my own mistakes. Time stretched on during that endless night. With every minute, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare worsened. The truck, which had once been my sanctuary of freedom, had transformed into a moving prison. I tried to speed up, hoping that velocity would erase the presence of that passenger, but it seemed that the faster I went, the more intense he became. His words echoed in my mind, and the sound of the engine blended with the rapid beating of my heart. Every distant town I glimpsed in the rearview mirror was nothing more than a specter, an illusory promise that the truth would dissipate. Yet with every turn, the stranger became even more present. There were moments when I nearly considered stopping the truck altogether, getting out and confronting the passenger. But the thought of facing that man, or whatever he was, paralyzed me. I knew that any attempt at confrontation could mean the end, not only of my journey, but of my sanity. And so I continued driving, eyes fixed on the road and a mind overwhelmed by a fear that could not be ignored. The night deepened and the temperature seemed to drop even further. The interior of the truck filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the stranger's intermittent voice. At times, I almost believed he was speaking to me in an intimate tone, as if we were confidants sharing a dark secret. "You have always hidden the truth behind your eyes," he murmured, as the road blurred by. His words pressed upon me, dredging up memories I had long since buried deep within. A turbulent youth, nights marked by misguided choices and reckless actions that had forever left their mark on my life. With every new declaration, the sense of despair grew. I tried to divert my thoughts, forcing my mind to focus solely on the road. But the passenger's revelations were relentless. He spoke of betrayals, guilt, and secrets so dark that I sometimes wondered if I was condemned to carry such burdens forever. His voice seemed unending, repeating his words like a dark echo that refused to fade. I felt that each word was like a sharp blade, slicing through the thin barrier I maintained between what was real and the torment within. At one point, the landscape shifted in a subtle yet unsettling way. The trees lining the road began to bend unnaturally, forming shadows that danced along the sides of my truck. The headlights revealed shapes that, at first glance, might have been mere trees, but soon appeared to take on human contours, as if figures were lurking in the darkness. This sight left me with the feeling that the night itself was conspiring to intensify my torment. I passed through narrow bridge spans, abandoned tunnels, and rural areas where time seemed to have stood still, and with each new scene, the presence of the passenger grew even more oppressive. During one such stretch, the truck suddenly halted on a section where the asphalt seemed to split in two directions, and my terror-stricken mind began playing tricks on me. It was then that I clearly heard footsteps outside, as if someone were slowly walking around the vehicle. The side door opened slowly, creaking as if lamenting the breaking of a centuries-old silence. My body froze. Adrenaline surged through every fiber of my being. Yet when I looked out the window, I saw nothing but endless darkness and the thin line separating the sky from the earth. Still, the feeling that something was watching my every move never left me. I restarted the engine and accelerated, in a desperate attempt to leave behind not just that moment, but also the feeling of being hunted by invisible forces. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the passenger remained. His figure, at times faint and almost translucent, reappeared in the seat beside me, his expression unchanged, as if he had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself completely. His voice blended with the sound of the engine, creating a macabre chorus that accompanied me every kilometer of the journey. At one point on the road, as I passed through an area of dense fog, visibility dropped drastically. The truck's lights became the only points of reference in a world where reality and imagination blurred together. In that oppressive atmosphere, the passenger's voice grew louder, more insistent, as if determined to invade every corner of my mind. "You cannot escape," he repeated, in a tone wavering between threat and despair. The fog seemed to absorb the silent screams of my soul as I struggled to keep control of the vehicle on a road that now turned into an endless labyrinth. Gradually, I began to notice details that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. A rusty sign pointed to a town I had never heard of, and curiously, in the rearview mirror, through the fog, I could glimpse figures slowly moving along the roadside. They appeared as mere shadows, yet I swore I saw, for a brief moment, a familiar face among them, a face marked by pain and loneliness. That fleeting glimpse only heightened the unease that already consumed my thoughts, making me wonder whether that passenger was a hallucination or the true reflection of an ancestral guilt. The feeling that I was being guided toward an inevitable destiny solidified with every passing moment. The passenger's words were not limited to mere accusations. They carried the weight of secrets I had never dared to confess, as if he had access to a hidden diary of my existence. I didn't know if those revelations were the result of some trick of my exhausted mind, or if there truly was something sinister behind that encounter. But doubt soon gave way to terror, a terror that made my body tremble and my head spin with each new revelation. Amid the darkness, I began to feel a pressure on my chest, as if an invisible force were trying to compress my breath. My hands, which had once gripped the steering wheel firmly, now trembled uncontrollably, and every curve of the road seemed to drag me into an endless abyss. The presence of the passenger became almost tangible. I could feel the chill of his proximity, even without touching him. It was as if he had merged with the very air inside the cabin, making it impossible to separate him from me. When the early morning began to give way to a gloomy twilight, the sense of distorted time reached its peak. I no longer knew how many hours or days I had been on that route, nor if any remnant of normalcy still existed. Reality unfolded into a mosaic of memories and fears, and the passenger's voice continued to resonate with surgical precision. "Every mistake of yours is recorded. Every secret of yours is mine." I tried with all my might to find a logical explanation for that phenomenon, but with each attempt at reasoning, his words disintegrated any certainty. The road, the shadows, and even the sky seemed to conspire to turn my journey into a succession of terrifying moments, with no hope of redemption or escape. The truck, which had once been my mobile home, had metamorphosed into a vessel of dread, and I, trapped in a cycle of revelations and doubts, could barely distinguish what was real from what was merely the product of my imagination. In one of those moments of despair, I stopped the truck in a dimly lit stretch, trying at least to catch my breath and gather my thoughts. I got out of the cabin, still trembling, and looked around. The road was deserted, and the night seemed to have swallowed all life around. Yet, behind the apparent stillness, I sensed that something was moving in the shadows, a presence that, though imperceptible, emanated a disturbing energy. For a brief moment, I stared into the void, hoping to find some answer, but all I found was the distant echo of the passenger's words. I then decided to return to the truck, locking myself back in the cabin as if I could find protection there. But when I sat down, the figure was there, as always, unchanged in expression. His eyes, fixed on mine, revealed a dark knowledge, and his voice manifested once again, now with a tone blending authority and despair. "You were always destined to face this," he murmured, and for a moment I felt that it was not just the road leading me to a tragic fate, but something greater, something that transcended the limits of my own existence. I resumed the journey, but the feeling that we were both trapped in an eternal cycle never left me. Every stretch of road seemed to repeat the same sequence of terror. The fog that swallowed the lights, the whispers that emerged from nowhere, and the unyielding presence of that passenger who, like a ghost, was part of my journey. I could no longer tell if he was a real entity or merely a manifestation of my worst nightmares. Doubt settled in, corroding any hope of escape or relief. Hours passed in a confusing blur, and the once familiar environment transformed into a scene of silent horrors. In a moment of near despair, while driving on a dirt road lined with twisted trees, the passenger spoke again, this time with a voice that reverberated throughout the cabin. Every turn, every kilometer has brought you here. You can't run anymore. His words blended with the sound of tires on gravel, creating a hypnotic and disturbing rhythm. I felt as if time itself had bowed to his will, causing reality to shatter into fragments of memories and unspeakable fears. I tried, unsuccessfully, to find a route that would take me away from that inevitable destiny. The GPS seemed to have lost its way, and the maps I so trusted showed nothing but an endless expanse of empty roads. The only certainty was the presence of that stranger whose existence defied all logic and turned every moment into an experience of pure terror. In one of those moments, as I crossed an old bridge, the truck shuddered as if passing through an inexplicable zone of turbulence. For a brief instant, the lights went out and silence took over, a silence so profound that I could hear the rapid beating of my own heart. When the lights came back on, the passenger had moved as if he had dematerialized and reassembled in another corner of the cabin. The tension reached an unbearable point. My hands wouldn't stop sweating, and with each new revelation, I felt that my life had been reduced to that endless road. The sound of the engine had become a rhythmic beat of a doomed heart, and the passenger's voice merged with the wind seeping through the cabin's cracks. I no longer knew if the secrets he revealed were real or merely fragments of a mind that refused to forget the sins of the past. But the sense of despair, the certainty that something terrible was lurking, was undeniable. As I approached a familiar stretch where the road took a sharp curve amid thick fog, the stranger spoke once more, with a clarity that cut through the silence like a blade. There is no redemption, only the weight of what you have done. His words brought no comfort. Instead, they intensified the terror that consumed me. I knew that that night, nothing would ever be the same. Reality had transformed into a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own, and I found myself powerless before a destiny that revealed itself with the coldness of an endless abyss at every moment. At that moment, as the early morning transformed into a macabre twilight, and the road continued to stretch out before me, I realized that there was no rational explanation for what I was experiencing. The passenger, with his unsettling presence, had embedded himself in every aspect of my existence, forcing me to relive memories I had long since buried. Every word, every look, every silence between us carried the promise that the truth, no matter how dark and terrifying it might be, would never be forgotten. I continued driving, with my mind consumed by a whirlwind of emotions and my soul marked by an inexplicable terror. The presence of the passenger had become the only constant that night, a specter that, regardless of the route taken, remained unchanged. Time, distance, and the miles turned into a macabre dance, where fate seemed to be shaped by invisible and cruel hands. When the night finally gave way to a gloomy dawn, I was still on the road, alone with my demons and with that stranger whom I had never asked to board. There was no resolution, no redemption, only the fear that had taken hold, as if every curve of the road held the echo of the words the passenger had whispered. Reality remained fragmented, and I saw myself doomed to follow a path where the past and the present intertwined in a whirlwind of secrets and regrets. Today, when I recall that night, I realize that it is not about a lesson or a moral. There is no moral, there is no redemption, only the memory of a terrifying encounter that defied all logic and left its mark on me forever. The road continues to stretch out, and lonely nights still carry with them the possibility that, in a moment of inattention, the passenger might reappear. And as I move forward, with the echoes of that terror resonating in every beat of the engine, all that remains is the feeling that sometimes the worst horrors hide between the lines of what we deem normal. I do not know if I will ever find an explanation for what I experienced that early morning, or if somehow I will be able to leave that encounter behind. What I do know is that, as long as the roads continue to stretch out ahead of me, the fear will remain, latent and silent, like an invisible passenger who refuses to disappear. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.